As a developer, I've built entire solutions from cradle to grave, and I've been very proud of a couple of those. I built a solution called Quanta that allowed for pay-per-view viewing of Windows Media Resources. It was a plugin for Windows Media Server 2003, and we built it before 2003 shipped. And it presented some interesting challenges as a developer because working with a beta product, the documentation for all of the APIs that we needed in order to do the deployment weren't possible. They just weren't there. So I ended up going to Microsoft in order to get the documentation that was needed and in order to talk to them about adding some features so that our product could connect to the parts that we needed to talk to in order to actually make this a fully integrated solution. This solution was particularly challenging because in order to write the application, some of the APIs were only exposed in VB, and some of the APIs were only exposed in C#, and some of the APIs were only exposed in C++. So we had to bounce between the various languages and build DLLs and COM objects in order to communicate between the various parts of the product. Then, because we needed to have an administrative interface and a place to store a whole bunch of data, we had to connect to SQL, and we really wanted a web interface in order to make the product as deployable as possible and have the lowest possible administration. The team that I had to work with was basically a team of 3, and it was me, a programmer that worked directly with me, and a contractor that we had contracted part of the web development to. The web development contractor didn't speak any VB or ASP, he worked specifically in PHP. As a result, we ended up with a kind of convoluted mess at first that I then took all of the code that was written in PHP and ported to VB. This follows with the rapid development philosophy that I've had in the past and mentioned in a couple of my other answers of taking a rapidly developed prototype, using that as a PRD so that you can then say what needs to be built over here. And that worked out very well for the web portion of this application because we had this nice looking, well-designed PHP interface that spoke SQL that we could then use all of the HTML from, and much of the code and SQL calls when we ported it to VB so that we had a very succinct, well-written, all .NET framework. When I switched to writing in Python for a project that I was working on in Google App Engine, I developed a product called CDN in a Box, which basically allowed me to use Google's App Engine as a content delivery network and do page-level caching. This was a really interesting project for me because when I started it, I didn't speak any Python. And I looked at just the documentation for how to use several of the functions, the URL fetch and some caching, and wrote a very early prototype in order to make sure that the product would work the way that I wanted. After doing the first round of prototyping, I rewrote the entire project again and didn't use pretty much any of the code from the first pass. The third version of the program was actually written in Java for Google App Engine because there were some calls that were supposed to be faster in Java than they were in Python. It turned out that those advances were then released into the next version of App Engine in the Python, and so I wrote a fourth version of the product in Python in order to take advantages of those new opportunities and the ability to do multi-threading and some increased memory management stuff. So I've done development projects where I owned everything. At Microsoft, most of my development experience was really about building test tools in order to automate processes so that we could do test passes without actually having to have somebody physically sitting there in order to run those test passes. So I've also written a software that takes 2D video and converts it to 3D, and that was written in a C-like language called AVISON. That was a very fun project because the specification or the PRD for the project basically would have said, make 2D video look good in 3D. And there wasn't a defined process. It was about taking the things that I knew worked and mashing them together so I could say, this thing, if you do it, will make things look a little 3D, and this thing, if you do it, will make things look a little 3D, and if you do this thing, it will make things look a little 3D. And stacking them on top of each other and tuning the gate and the dial so that you could find things that worked. And then also figuring out when things didn't work or when you didn't want to stack the methods on. It was also a matter of doing very interesting programming techniques like scene change detection. You know, determining this image doesn't look enough like this image, they're probably not related. Doing contrast adjustment on the fly so that you could find edges no matter what the lighting conditions were. These were very interesting, very hard problems to solve that a person who does nothing but video programming might not have found challenge in. But as someone who doesn't do development all day, every day, I found to be very interesting challenges for which there was no documentation, and I was simply working off of instinct and feeling in order to find resolution. And then in order to do the tests, I basically had to have, you know, friends come over and watch videos, because after you've watched the video enough time, you can't even decide which one looks better anymore. You've got to have a raw audience say, I like this one, I like this one gives me a headache. So development for me has always been something that I've enjoyed, especially if I can work on it in terms of rapid prototyping, so that I can say, this is the problem, this is how we solve it, and then we can revise it and go on to the next thing. In terms of languages that I speak, I kind of hit on them a little. C#, VB, C++, several C-like languages, PHP, Java, Python. I worked well with SQL, Google App Engine's data store / GQL, and I can pick up just about any of the languages that are out there. I've worked some with Ruby, but I haven't written full programs in Ruby. But once you start to speak enough of the languages, reading code is generally pretty easy. And things tend to either be written in C-like languages, or in Java-like languages, or BASIC-like languages. And so as long as you have a fundamental in each of them, I think that you can generally work in any of the languages that are out there.